Hello everyone and welcome to Solomon's Cave. This is an introduction to Exodus, the second book of the Bible. If you missed the first book or want to see it again, you can click the I in the top right corner of the screen and you should be able to find it there. Alright, now on to Exodus, or as it is called in Hebrew, Ve'ele Shemoth. Just as with Genesis, it is the first word, or in this particular case the first two words, that determine the name of this book in Hebrew. The meaning of the Hebrew title is, "These are the names." This probably also explains why, in this case, the title is the first two words as opposed to just the first one word, since if it were only the first word, it would just be "these," and that doesn't say a whole lot about what this book is. I guess a lot of books can start with the word "these," so that is why they picked the first two words. When this book was translated into Greek several centuries later, the new title became Exodus, referring to the departure of Israel out from the land of Egypt, as it means departure. Now you may be curious to know if the word Exodus also appears in the New Testament, like we saw the word Genesis all of a sudden appear in the Gospel of Matthew. And it so happens that it does. And for this we have to go to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 9, and I will read verses 28 through 31. Jesus took Peter, John and James with him, and he went up the mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his face was altered and his clothing became dazzling white. And look, two men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. Now this departure that Moses and Elijah are discussing is a reference to Jesus' death, which will come several chapters later. But the word that we find in the Greek text here is, you might have guessed it already, Exodus. Luke is using the word Exodus to refer to Jesus' death, and so making a comparison between the history of the people of Israel and the life of Jesus. Now let's take a look at what is inside the book of Exodus. For practical reasons, I will divide the book of Exodus in two parts, with the first part being about Israel in Egypt and on its way to Mount Sinai, and the second part about Israel at Mount Sinai. With this division, the first 19 chapters cover the first part, and it starts with Israel in Egypt. Kind of where Israel was at the end of Genesis, but not exactly. At first, namely at the end of Genesis, they were welcomed as guests, but now they were unwelcome aliens and the Pharaoh oppresses Israel. Then the story focuses on Moses, as he grows up at the court of Pharaoh until he is forced to flee abroad. After some time abroad, God calls Moses and tells him to liberate the people of Israel from their oppression. Moses goes back and confronts the Pharaoh, but when he does not listen, God strikes the land of Egypt with 10 horrific plagues. Finally, after a lot of misery on the part of the Egyptians, Israel leaves the country and miraculously crosses the Sea of Reeds. You may have heard this story that they crossed the Red Sea, which is probably not technically wrong, and it is also how it was translated into the Greek translation, but the Hebrew text calls it the Sea of Reeds, so that's what I'll call it. And then the people traveled to Mount Sinai. At Sinai, the second part of Exodus begins, covering chapters 20 through 40. And the first thing that God does is that he gives Moses and the people of Israel the 10 commandments, or the 10 words. Then the text goes on discussing a variety of other laws that discuss mainly civil life. This is followed by a formal affirmation of the covenant between God and the people of Israel. If you were to compare the relationship between God and Israel to a marriage, as some of the later prophets would actually do, then perhaps this is the moment when God and Israel officially sign the marriage act. This is then followed by a long description of how the tabernacle, that is the mobile place of worship, is supposed to be constructed. Once everything is described, the covenant is already broken. The people of Israel started worshipping a golden calf. God then wants to cancel the whole ordeal, but Moses prays for the people. Then, after the people are punished, Moses goes back up the mountain, and then the people start actually constructing the tabernacle. The book ends with God entering the tabernacle, meaning that from now on, God would be present in a special way among the people of Israel. Now let's have a look at some of the structures in the book of Exodus. First, I will look at the macro structure of the tabernacle and how it is described. This covers most of the second part of Exodus. And then I will discuss the way the 10 plagues are structured. As you may already have noticed, the tabernacle is discussed in great detail. Twice. Being briefly interrupted by the episode of the golden calf. This leads to a structure of A. Instructions, B. Golden calf, and A', that is how theologians like to write out this structure, construction. And a careful reading will show that almost everything in A is repeated in A'. The order differs somewhat between A and A', but both of them include the following: the Ark of the Covenant, the tent with a separation between the holy and the most holy place, also called the Holy of Holies in some translations, the table for the bread, the lampstand or the menorah, the altar for the burning of incense, the outer court, within it the bronze altar for animal sacrifices, and the washing basin. They also both include a description of the priestly robes and their inauguration rituals, the way the whole ordeal was to be financed, and the names of the 2 leading craftsmen, namely Bezaleel and Oholiab. Now, what is the purpose of repeating all this information? Why can chapters 35 through 40 not just read, "And so they did as they were instructed"? That would save a lot of paper. Well, these kinds of structures, both at the micro level and the macro level, are very, very common in the Bible. And they do a few things. First of all, they put extra emphasis on what is at the center. In this case, the episode of the golden calf. And if you read that episode, you will see that the story of the golden calves follows a very simple pattern. Starting with 1, Israel has a covenant. 2, Israel breaks the covenant. 3, God punishes Israel. And 4, the covenant is restored. There is a lot of theology in this very simple schedule. But the main takeaway from this is something that is going to be repeated over and over again in the Bible. Namely, that Israel has a covenant with God. Israel constantly breaks the covenant of God, which is exactly why they get punished by God all the time. But God is always willing to restore the covenant again with His people. Secondly, this macro structure also emphasizes the importance of what is repeated. In this case, it is the fact that God gives very elaborate and precise instructions on how He wishes to be worshipped, and how He wants His presence to be understood by the people of Israel. God's presence among the people of Israel is to be regarded as something special, something that is different from everyday life, and something that makes Israel different from all the other nations. That is why the instructions for the tabernacle are repeated twice, because it was so important. Another part of Exodus that is very carefully structured is the episode of the 10 plagues. There are at least 3 different types of structures that are carefully interwoven in this whole section. First of all, there is a cyclical structure to the 10 plagues. There are 3 cycles of 3 plagues each, with one final climactic plague. Secondly, there is a structure that builds up towards a climax. And finally, there is an inclusion, where the end in some ways mirrors the beginning. So let's start with the cyclical structure. As I said before, there are 3 cycles of 3 plagues each, and one final plague. In each cycle, it is only for the first 2 that Moses is described as going to Pharaoh in order to give a warning. And then of these two warnings, the first ones always occur in the morning and outside, while the second of these warnings occur in Pharaoh's palace. When we look closer, we see that there is also a build-up to a climax. This is clear from a few indicators, one of them being that the agent of the plagues shifts. For the first 3 plagues, we see that it is Aaron who is performing a ritual that causes the plague. Then God brings about 2 plagues without a human agent. Then Moses performs the ritual for the 5th through the 9th plague, and then finally, in the 10th plague, it is God again. Secondly, if you pay attention to the magicians at Pharaoh's court, you will see that they are slowly losing control. Initially, they are able to reproduce the plagues, but after the 3rd plague, they admit defeat. They can no longer reproduce anything beyond the 3rd plague. And once we hit the 6th plague, they can no longer even stand up because of the plagues. From the 3rd plague on is also the moment when Israel, or the land of Goshen, is exempt from the results of each plague. And at the same time, the Pharaoh is more and more willing to compromise to let the Israelites go. He makes promises of one sort or another after plagues numbers 2, 4, 7, 8, 9 and 10, even though, like a real politician, he ends up breaking all of those promises as soon as he thinks he can get away with it. And finally, it does seem that the first 3 plagues are mostly based around water and water-based animals. Then plagues 4 through 6 emphasize the impact the plague has on the land and on the land-dwelling creatures. And plagues 7 through 9 all have something to do with the air or the sky. And then let's briefly look at the inclusion that I found. This isn't the main structure, but it is still interesting to see that during the first 3 plagues, the staff of Moses is mentioned explicitly. But then for the next 4 plagues, the staff seems to completely disappear, only to re-emerge for the final 3 plagues again. This way, the structure is all neatly wrapped up. And then finally, we will have a look at what all of this means. And like with the book of Genesis, this is just my subjective opinion on what I think is important in this book. First, the book of Exodus shows God as a mighty liberator. In many later books of the Bible, God is often described or praised as a savior or a liberator. If you're not familiar with this biblical language, you may be asking, well, what did God save people from? And the answer is, on the one hand, that God saves people from a variety of different things. But in the minds of the biblical authors, the Exodus is the example of all examples of God being a liberator. And the story of the Exodus is probably the most often mentioned event in the whole Bible. Secondly, it confirms the covenant that God has made with Israel. In the book of Genesis, there are a few examples of God making covenants with people, for example with Noah or with Abraham. And in later books, God makes covenants with other people like David. But this is, once again, the quintessential covenant that God makes with the people of Israel. So Exodus combines the quintessential act of God saving a people from slavery with the quintessential covenant. What else could fit in this brief list that is of similar importance? Well, what about God coming to live among His people? The greatest act of salvation, followed by the greatest legal unification in the form of a covenant, is topped off by God coming down and being present here on earth, making this tabernacle the only place in the whole universe where heaven and earth come together. So I think that wraps it up. Though I had originally planned to also talk in great detail about the 10 plagues and what they mean. However, I soon figured out that that would make this video way too long, so I decided to put that in a separate bonus video that will come out tomorrow. In the meantime, please like, share and subscribe to my channel, and I will see you for the next one.